Hey, Saki, I'm going to do this before I lose the nerve or think about it. And then I won't do it because I will realize it's not a good idea. Okay, so my question is, what do you do when you have a brother like I do who's a doctor and he loves you very, very much? So he tells me things that the other doctors don't tell the other people, like this. He told me when I was really young that yeast infections are sexually transmitted. What? Okay, so I would get yeast infections, and this is why they don't say this to all the patients. I would get yeast infections if I had to take antibiotics. That was a given. Duh. But yeast infections are sexually transmitted. That may not be the only reason you get them, because I would take antibiotics and get them, but they are sexually transmitted. And you know that because if you have a yeast infection and you have sex with this guy and he goes away, just goes away, and then you treat the yeast infection, with that Monistat that I used to buy at the drugstore. So you treat the yeast infection, and then that guy comes back and you have sex with him and you have the yeast infection again. So it's sexually transmitted because when you had the sex with him the first time and you had the yeast infection, he picked up that yeast infection on his foreskin. You know that little round part that is almost at the tip, his foreskin? All right, so he doesn't feel it, he doesn't itch, he doesn't anything. He just goes away. And he might have sex with other people. And then he will come back to you. And if you have sex with him again, you will get another yeast infection. That's because the yeast infection is sexually transmitted. And when you had sex with him the first time, you gave him the yeast infection. And then he went over there and over there and over there. But when he came back, he gave you the yeast infection. And he gave that girl the yeast infection and that girl the yeast infection too. So when you treat yourself for the yeast infection, if you like him, you will treat him for the yeast infection too, because he has the yeast infection under his foreskin. And he don't have no symptoms, nothing, ever. But let him go around the block and come back, and you will have the yeast infection again. That's why when my girlfriend's husband came back from Iraq or wherever he was, he gave her a huge, major yeast infection. And that's because while he was away, he picked up yeast infection under his foreskin. And, the army probably showered him with pesticides and all kind of stuff before he came home. But they didn't pay attention to his foreskin because, you know, that's not a big spot. And he had yeast infections under that foreskin from who knows, you know, whatever country he was in, whatever. And he brought it back to his wife. And, you know, she had sex with him the first time in like a year or whatever. And she got the biggest yeast infection she ever had in her life. Okay, I'm not going to show this video to everybody. All right. I love you. Goodbye.